The spiritual intervention that I have chosen is psalm writing, which is essentially a form of poetry therapy, where we use language, imagery, metaphor, story in therapeutic capacities. We have all heard it said, I'm sure, that in life we are either in the middle of a storm, coming out of a storm, or getting ready to go into a storm. Life is constantly in a state of flux. And the Old Testament theologian Walter Brueggemann, he insightfully categorized the Psalms in this way. He says that there are Psalms of orientation. Those are the times in life where we feel stable, life makes sense. They're times of well-being. Then he says there are Psalms of disorientation. That's when life happens and does not make sense, where we encounter pain and suffering. There is this sense that life is not fair. And then he says there are Psalms of reorientation, where we are overcoming despair. Those are times of discovering and experiencing joy again. And one paper that I read took Brueggemann's psalm categories and applied them to the 3 stages of what's called intersubjectivity theory, which is a theory of relationality. I found this fascinating. The first stage in intersubjectivity theory is a state of union where there are 2 subjects who are both contributing to the interaction, but it lacks differentiation. This is like the orientation Psalms, where life is good, things make sense, we are deriving a strong sense of identity from our faith community. It represents, I sort of see it as like the beginning of us relating to God, but the relationship lacks maturity. And then the second stage of intersubjectivity theory is called complementarity. This is the stage where the relationship begins to break down. The 2 subjects are locked in a state of conflict, one being the doer and one being done to, if that makes sense. This is kind of like the Psalms of disorientation, where we are hurt, we are full of questions. There seems to be a distance between us and God. There's a dissonance between our faith in God and our suffering. And then the third and final stage of intersubjectivity theory is called the differentiated third. And in this stage, we recognize and we are recognized. There is union, but there's also distinction. This is the stage that's really transformative, where the encounters between the 2 subjects are being co-created. This is kind of like the Psalms of reorientation, where we move out of our suffering and into a newly realized and deepened faith in God. It's like we have this new kind of relationship with Him. And I think the Psalms can be both a companion through each of these stages in our relationship with God, but also I see them kind of as a catalyst maybe for moving us from one stage to another. So let's look at why the Psalms, and then we'll look at why writing. Like we already said, the Psalms are poetry, so they engage us at the level of our emotions, not just intellectually. They reach places inside of us that other biblical literature is not going to reach. In Alicia Michelle's book, Emotional Confidence, she talks about how important it is for Christians especially to learn to acknowledge their emotions. She says unprocessed emotions are having a disastrous impact on our ability to trust God and to grow in spiritual maturity. And I think sometimes as Christians, we can be fearful of our emotions because we feel this enormous pressure to always be joyful in our duty to represent Christ well. And so I think the Psalms can really help us to connect with our emotions, which is so important. And speaking of emotions, the Psalms cover the whole range of human experience. We are going to find ourselves and our situations and our feelings in the Psalms. Leslie Leyland Fields says that when we think of the Bible, we think of this big book of God speaking to His people, but then smack dab in the middle of it is this book of God's people speaking back to Him. And I love how she describes the words of the Psalms. She says, these are not careful words, not words whispered fearfully to a far distant God, not sedate or prim words of religious posturing, but words of anger, agony, despair, abandonment, anxiety, words of fierce hope, rejoicing, confidence. With 150 Psalms to choose from, the Psalms will teach us to talk to God in all sorts of different ways, through lament, confession, trust, praise, thanksgiving. All right, so the Psalms engage us emotionally. They cover the whole range of human experience, and they are relational. They remind us we're not alone. They connect us and ground us in a broad and ancient community, because the Psalms have been ministering to human hearts for over 2,500 years. I love how Owens puts it: if the client can relate to the struggle of the psalmist, perhaps he or she can see him or herself relating to the triumph of the psalmist. And speaking of being relational, most importantly, I think the Psalms can help foster this loving attachment between us and God, which I believe is the true source of transformation and growth and change in any of our lives. Jim Wilder has said that ever since the Enlightenment, what we believe has replaced who we love as the defining mark of our Christian life. But he says that from a neuroscience perspective, a chain of beliefs is actually building on one of the weakest links to character in our brains. And he says the strongest foundation for character building in our brains is love, an intimate knowing that produces unfailing trust in the goodness of God. He says that neuroscience really does show us that our faith is indeed a relationship, not a religion. And I think that the Psalms beautifully express this, because the Psalms are not just theoretical talk about God. They show us a direct line of communication to God. Another study that I looked at examined how people who had daily spiritual experiences managed their suffering. Now, the paper didn't specify how the subjects actually achieved these daily spiritual experiences, but what they were asked was whether they felt God's presence that day, if they felt guided by God in the midst of their daily activities, and if they felt God's love for them directly. And they found that people who experienced these three things actually had immediate benefits in coping with their suffering. And so I think psalm writing would definitely be a means to experiencing these daily spiritual realities of feeling God's presence, feeling guided by God, and feeling God's personal love for you. Okay, so that's why the Psalms, but why writing? I think we'd all agree that it's important to put our feelings into words. There was a 2007 study done that demonstrated how the simple task of affect labeling, just naming our emotions, actually disrupted the fight or flight response in the amygdala. More recent studies have shown that this is most effective with high intensity situations. So amazing. Just the simple task of naming our emotions, and writing into the Psalms is definitely going to help us with that. Secondly, writing slows us down to a pace that really fosters dialogue between us and God. It creates room for us to hear him speaking back to us as well. Even just taking the time to rewrite a psalm, in its original words, can be a very different experience than simply, quickly reading it on the page. Thirdly, writing our own prayers using the Psalms as a model or a guide can help us find our voice. I read a paper explaining how psalm writing was used with a group of Zulu women. Now, all of these women were in their 20s. They were HIV positive. They were unemployed and unmarried mothers. So these young women knew suffering. They participated in a workshop that walked them through some of the lament psalms, and then they were invited to write their own individual lament, and then later they came together to write communally, to write a communal lament together. And it was a really powerful process. The paper highlighted how writing their own lament helped these women to regain their sense of agency. Secondly, it gave them permission to insist on their right to justice by asking God to deal with the perpetrator and leaving vengeance in his hands. And then thirdly, it helped them discover God, or an element of hope that helped to move them forward. So the Psalms can help us find our voice by writing. They can slow us down to a pace that fosters dialogue when we take the time to write into a psalm. And writing is going to help us put our feelings into words. So when would this intervention be indicated? I think it's particularly indicated when a client is a Christian with some familiarity with the Psalms. I think it's important that our interventions are culturally sensitive and personally relevant. I think somebody who is feeling isolated or in need of hope, I think it would be particularly good with clients who are open to processing narratively and who enjoy putting pen to paper and exploring their own stories. I think psalm writing could be particularly helpful for clients who find it difficult to put their suffering into their own words, because the Psalms are going to give them images and metaphors and ideas for words that they might not be able to just pull out of the air for themselves. On the other hand, when would it not be indicated? Obviously, if the client is resistant to an approach like this, perhaps they just have no appreciation for poetry, or maybe they don't want to bring faith or God into the counseling session. I think too, if writing is a stressful activity for them, particularly due to a learning disability, maybe just the mechanics of writing and getting things down on paper, that's not easy for everybody. As an aside here though, I did read a paper of a study that was done using Lectio Divina to meditate on a psalm a day, and then it measured for increases in hope and flow and well-being in the subjects. So Lectio Divina, it doesn't involve the writing aspect, but it does still involve that slowed down, meditative, personalized aspect. And so it could be an auditory option for people who maybe that have learning disabilities that make writing a challenge. So what is the process? Psalm writing really, it's a prayerful solitary activity in my mind. So I kind of see it perhaps best assigned as homework between sessions. So then the session itself would be more for instruction in the process, explaining the heart behind it, and then discussing the experience afterwards. So the therapist would then become that empathetic witness to their words as they read their psalm prayers aloud. I can also see it though being really effective for group sessions. When I think of that study that was done with the Zulu women, how they participated like in a workshop type setting and then took times to write individually as well as together. So I think it could work in a group setting. Leslie Leyland Fields has a great acronym in her book that gives some really wonderful ideas for interacting with the Psalms. She uses the word nearing. Her book is called Nearing a Far God. And so each letter in the word stands for another idea of how to interact with a psalm. So N is for notate, which is writing out the original psalm by hand, an action that uses both sides of our brain. E is for express, that's using your voice, your body gestures, using movement to give full expression to the psalm. A is for amplify, which is where you add your responses and circumstances and witness to the psalm. R is for read, understanding the original psalm in its context by reading it in many different translations can be helpful. I is for identify. This is personalizing the psalm to you or to your faith community. The second N stands for New Testament fulfillment. This is where we add relevant New Testament verses that augment and fulfill the message of the psalm. And then G is for gather, where we share our psalm prayers. So it's not that you would do this as a step-by-step process. This is just a list of different ideas for ways to interact with the Psalms. So for example, you might just choose to read, notate, identify, and express. Maybe you would just choose those four. The gather step I see as being done either by the client sharing their psalm prayer with a trusted friend or family member, or even with the therapist in the next session, because having a witness for our words is such a crucial step in the healing process. And I think it's also important to make it clear with the client that for the amplifying and the identifying, we are not rewriting scripture. We are responding to it. We are learning from these psalms how to name our own emotions and struggles. And in this process, it's like God moves from our head into our very lives, more intimately present with us. So let's give it a try. Based on where you feel you're at with the whole orientation, disorientation, reorientation model, press pause now and just choose a psalm to sit with for the next few minutes. Okay, once you've chosen your psalm, take a moment to calm your body and your mind. You can close your eyes if you feel comfortable doing that, and focus on your breathing. Take a deep breath in through your nose and feel your rib cage expand. And then release your breath slowly through your mouth. If you do this a few times, you'll notice that your body is more relaxed, your mind is more focused, and you will be more ready to hear from the Lord. So as you continue to breathe deeply, whisper a prayer to him now. Tell Jesus that he has your full attention and invite him to speak to you. So I invite you now to press pause again and read through your chosen psalm. Read through it attentively. You can read it in a few different translations if that's helpful. So just press pause and sit with your psalm for a few moments. Now, let's choose one of those translations to write out our psalm by hand and leave a space, leave a few blank lines between each verse as you copy out the psalm. So you can press pause and do that now. All right, let's go back and spend some time meditating on each verse. What can you identify with? How can you add your own situation or circumstance or emotions? Below each verse in that blank space that you left, write your own psalm prayer. Go verse by verse and personalize it to your life. As an example, I spent some time this week in prayer in Psalm 11. I'm kind of in this uncertain season of life right now. As a military family, this is the time of year that we kind of brace ourselves for the potential of being reposted to a new place. And there is a possibility that our family could be moved this year. And I don't do that well with the unknown and not being able to plan. So let me read for you the first few verses from Psalm 11 along with my responses so that you can get an idea of how this works. So verse 1 says, "In the Lord I take refuge. How then can you say to me, flee like a bird to your mountain?" And my response was, I am going to make the Lord my home, where I dwell comfortably, even when my worries are telling me I need to find other cover for safety. Verse 2 says, "For look, the wicked bend their bows. They set their arrows against the strings to shoot from the shadows at the upright in heart." And my response was, my anxious thoughts are stringing their bows, pulling back on their arrows of fear. I can't see them in the shadows, but I know they're there, and I know they're aiming straight for my heart. Verse 3 says, "When the foundations are being destroyed, what can the righteous do?" My response was, when the ground is shifting under my feet, what can I do to steady myself? When I don't know what's ahead, what do I do to prepare? Verse 4 says, "The Lord is in his holy temple. The Lord is on his heavenly throne. He observes everyone on earth. His eyes examine them." And my response was, no matter how things change down here for me, the Lord's throne and his heavenly temple does not move at all. He is sitting there still, not moving a muscle, but keeping a keen eye on everything and everyone. And that includes me. I am sitting in his sight right now. His gaze is holding me. So there's a little bit of an example. I invite you now to press pause and take a few minutes to write your responses to your chosen psalm, verse by verse. All right, now it's time to express our psalm prayers. So feel free to stand up and get your whole body in on this stage of the process. We are embodied creatures, and our bodies have a remarkable influence on our emotions. So feel free to raise your hands, to bow your head, to kneel on your knees, even to lay prostrate, or maybe God is leading you to twirl and dance. And as you say your psalm prayer to him, or even sing these words to him, just express your words in whatever way his Spirit directs you as you read your prayer to the Lord. Well, I wish that we could share our prayers in person and in the process share a little slice of each of our stories with one another. I hope that this presentation has given you a little peek into psalm writing and how it could be used as a powerful tool in your counseling practice.